The first thing the drunk man did was throw a full cup of spiced wine across the white glove of a royal guard, and the last thing he did that night was beg a princess to remember his father's name. Between those two moments lay about 3 hours, one broken parapet, and the single most disciplined act of restraint I have ever watched a man perform. I have worn the black of the household military police for 19 years. I have arrested lords and lamplighters, cut purses and cavalry officers. I thought I understood what it meant to hold a line. I did not truly, until I stood on the Queen's Walk on the night of the Founder's illumination, and watched Guardsman Edrick Thorne refuse to move while a fool did everything a fool can do to make him. My name is Maddox Crane. I am a provost sergeant, which is a plain way of saying it is my duty to keep the peace among the crowds that press against the crown ceremonies, and to know precisely who may be touched and who may not. That last part matters more than you would think. A provost's real education is not in the laws he may enforce, but in the men he is quietly told he may not. On the night this story begins, I had already been told about Perrin Vance twice before he threw the wine, and I want you to remember that, because the shame of this account is partly mine. The Founder's illumination is the brightest night in Eldermore's year. On the eve of it, the whole of Harrogate lights itself. Every window of the palace burns with candle and lamp, and along the Queen's Walk, the long stone promenade that runs beside the reflecting canal beneath the eastern face of the palace, they raise the great iron brazier stands, taller than a man, each one crowned with a bowl of fire that throws its light down onto the black water, so that the canal seems to hold a second city of flame. Thousands come. Families spread from the forecourt gates all the way along the walk to the water stairs, that steep flight of worn stone steps where, in older days, the barges of the house would tie up. On illumination night the barges are gone and the stairs are roped off, and the crowd banks up against the low parapet that runs the length of the canal, and everyone waits for the moment when the king appears on the eastern balcony and the whole realm, or the whole city at least, lifts its lanterns to him at once. The guards stand their posts along the walk that night as on every night, only there are more of them, and the crowd is closer, and the light on their tunics turns the red to something like living coals. Guardsman Thorne held the post at the head of the water stairs. It is not a glamorous post. It is, in fact, the post no one wants, because it is the one place along the walk where the crowd and the drop meet, where the press of celebrating people comes right up to the low parapet, and beyond that parapet the old stone stairs fall away 12 steep steps into the dark canal. A rope and 2 brass stanchions were all that closed the stairs off. A guard at that post is not decoration. He is the thing that stands between a crowd that does not think about the water and the water that does not care about the crowd. I mention all of this now because you must see the ground before you can understand the night. A man who wanted only to insult a guard could have done it anywhere along the walk and been merely tedious. A man who chose to make his trouble at the head of the water stairs, in the crush, beside the drop, that man was building a disaster whether he knew it or not. Perrin Vance did not know it. Perrin Vance never in his life had to know where the edges were, because someone had always been paid to stand between him and them. His father is Master Halbert Vance, and if you have warmed your hands at any brazier in Harrogate, you have warmed them at the Vance forges. The iron of the brazier stands themselves, the great fluted columns, the fire bowls, the clawed feet bolted to the stone, came from the Vance works under a crown contract worth more coin than I will see in 10 lifetimes. Master Vance supplies the household its iron, its gates, its railings, its brackets, the cressets on the walk. He is not a lord. He is something the modern age has made that is in some ways stronger than a lord, a man the crown owes money to. And Perrin was his only son, 24 years old, with his father's breadth of shoulder and none of his father's patience, and a habit of drinking that the whole of the merchant quarter knew about and no one dared to name to his face. I was told about him at the 6th bell when the crowds were still gathering and the braziers were only just lit. My own captain, a careful man named Loris Bell, drew me aside beneath the forecourt arch and put it plainly. "The Vance boy is on the walk tonight, and he has been in the wine since noon. Master Vance sent word he'd like his son shown every courtesy. Keep him from harm, keep him from the newsmen, and for the love of the crown keep this quiet." Then he added the sentence that a provost learns to hear behind a great many polite sentences: "He is not to be handled." Not to be handled. There it was, the whole rotten machinery of it in 3 words. I have arrested drunkards by the score and never thought twice. But a drunkard whose father the crown owes 12 years of contracts to, that is not a drunkard, that is a delicate matter, and delicate matters do not get arrested, they get managed. I nodded to Captain Bell as if he had said something reasonable, because in the world we both served it was reasonable, and I went out onto the walk to find the Vance boy and manage him. I found him at the head of the water stairs, of course. Where else? He had planted himself directly in front of Guardsman Thorne's post, and he had gathered a little audience of his own, 3 or 4 young men of his own set, laughing too loudly, and a wider ring of ordinary festival-goers who had stopped the way people always stop when someone is making a scene, half appalled and half entertained. Perrin Vance stood swaying gently on the balls of his feet, a full cup of spiced wine in his fist, and he was addressing the guard as a man addresses a statue he has decided to make ridiculous. "He won't look at me," Vance was announcing to his friends, delighted. Watch this. I have been standing here. How long have I been standing here?" One of his friends, a thin youth with an anxious face, muttered something. "An age. I've been standing here an age, and this splendid fellow will not so much as move his eyes. Do you know what you are?" He leaned in close to Thorne's face, close enough that I could see the guard's jaw from where I stood, and the jaw did not so much as tighten. "You're a toy. A wound-up toy soldier they stand out here to amuse the tourists. Say something. Go on. Prove you're a man and not a clockwork." Guardsman Thorne said nothing. He looked, as a guard on post is trained to look, at a point some middle distance above the crowd, at nothing and at everything. He was perhaps 30, tall, with the kind of stillness that is not emptiness but the opposite of emptiness, a great deal held very quiet. The firelight moved on the brass of his buttons and on the barrel of the rifle at his shoulder, and he did not move at all, and this, more than anything the drunk man could have said, seemed to enrage Perrin Vance. Because a drunk man in front of an audience needs an answer, and a man who will not give him one has, without lifting a finger, taken something from him. "Nothing," Vance said, and his voice had changed, lost some of its performance and gained an edge. "Not a word. My father built the very fire you're standing next to, do you understand that? Every scrap of iron on this walk my family's hands made it, and they put you out here to guard it, and you can't even guard your own dignity." He lifted the cup. I was moving before he did it, pushing through the ring of onlookers, but I was 6 paces back and the crowd was thick and I was too slow, and I saw the arc of the wine before I could reach it. A dark ribbon flung across the space between them, and it struck Guardsman Thorne full across the chest and the right glove and spattered up along his jaw. The crowd made a sound, not a cheer and not quite a gasp, something in between, the noise a crowd makes when a line it did not know was there has just been crossed. The spiced wine ran down the red wool in a darker stain and dripped from the white glove that held the rifle, and Guardsman Thorne did not flinch. He did not wipe it. He did not turn his head. He stood exactly as he had stood, eyes forward, a man wearing another man's insult like weather. And for one long moment the only thing that moved on that whole stretch of the walk was the wine sliding down his sleeve and the fire snapping in the great bowl above them both. I reached them then. I put myself between the guard's post and Perrin Vance with a hand raised, and I used the voice, the flat official voice that has ended 100 scenes before they became something worse. "That's the end of it, sir. That's enough. You'll come away from the post now." Vance turned his wine-bright eyes on me and read my black coat and the provost's badge on it, and I watched him do the sum that men like him always do, the swift, careless arithmetic of who I was and who his father was, and I watched him decide the sum came out in his favor. He smiled. "Provost," he said warmly, as if greeting an old servant. "Splendid. You can tell this clockwork toy to answer a gentleman when he's spoken to. Go on, that's your job, isn't it, keeping order?" He gestured grandly at Thorne, and the wine cup, empty now, dangled from his fingers. "There's no order here. He's ignoring me. That's an insult to my father's house, that is. And here is the shame I promised you. I did not arrest him. I should have. A man had just thrown wine on a crown guardsman before 1,000 witnesses, and by any law I served that was assault upon the household, and I had the right and the duty to take him by the arm and walk him off the walk and into a cell to sober. But Captain Bell's 3 words were in my ears: 'He is not to be handled,' and Master Vance's iron was under every fire on the promenade, and so I did what the machinery had trained me to do. I managed him. 'Come away, sir,' I said, gentler than he deserved. 'Come and let me find you and your friends a better view of the balcony. The king will show himself within the hour, and you'll want to be well placed for it. This is no spot for a gentleman. It's all crush and rabble down here by the stairs.' He let me steer him a few paces off, because being flattered was agreeable to him, and his friends closed around, and I thought, God forgive me, I thought that I had done my work, that I had smoothed the delicate matter and kept it quiet as I'd been told. I looked back once at Guardsman Thorne. He had not moved. The wine was drying dark on his tunic, and he stood the post as though nothing at all had happened, and something in the set of him, I could not have named it then, told me the night was not finished. A man does not throw wine on a wall to make himself feel better. He does it to make the wall react. And when the wall does not react, a certain kind of man does not go home. He goes looking for a bigger stone. I should have arrested him under the arch and been done. Instead, I walked him toward the water and told myself it was peace. It held for perhaps half an hour. I have thought since that a man like Perrin Vance measures his evening not in hours but in reactions, in the number of times the world flinches at him, and that half an hour was simply how long it took him to become bored with a crowd that would not flinch. I stationed myself where I could watch him without crowding him. A provost learns to be a wall a man does not notice he is leaning on, and for a while he was almost pleasant, holding court among his friends near the 3rd brazier, telling some long story about a horse and a wager while the thin, anxious youth refilled his cup from a leather flask. But his eyes kept going back down the walk to the head of the water stairs, to the guard who had not answered him, and each time they went there his mouth tightened, and I knew the piece was borrowed and I was paying the interest. While it held, I did a foolish thing that turned out to be the wisest thing I did all night. I went and talked to the guard at the next post down. Guardsmen do not gossip on duty, but the post south of the water stairs was held that night by an older man named Hale, a 20-year soldier with a surgeon's eye who had trained half the walk, and I had known him long enough to ask a question sideways and get an answer sideways back. I stood near his post as though watching the crowd, and I said, "Lo, the man on the stairs, Thorne. He rode wine in the face without a blink. Is he always so cold?" Hale did not turn his head, of course, but his mouth moved barely. "Cold," he repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it wrong. "No, not cold. You've got it backwards, Provost. A cold man is a man with nothing in him. Thorne's the other kind. He's the kind that's got so much in him he's had to learn to keep the door shut on it, or it'd take the door off the hinges." A pause, while a knot of festival-goers drifted past between us. "He soldiered before he came to the walk, not ceremonial, the real kind out on the frontier the year the passes went bad. He was one of a handful that held a crossing so a column of folk could get clear, farmers, families, the whole of a valley running from something worse than weather. Held it 3 days. Most of the handful didn't come back down off that crossing." Hale's jaw tightened a fraction. "He did. And I think a man who stood on a thing like that and held it while it cost what it cost, I think that man learns the difference between what's worth spending yourself on and what isn't, and he learns it so deep it's in his bones. A drunk throwing wine. That's not worth a blink. He knows to a hair what's worth a blink and what isn't. That's not coldness, Provost. That's a man who's already paid to learn the price of everything. I have thought about that a great deal since. At the time it only unsettled me, because I had come to Hale hoping to hear that Thorne was a stoic, a stone, a man who felt nothing and so could ride anything, and instead I had been told the opposite, that the stillness was a lid and there was a great deal underneath it, and it had been welded shut not by emptiness but by a knowledge of cost that most of us are lucky enough never to earn. A stone does not choose to stand still. It simply cannot move. A man like Thorne chooses, every second, not to spend himself, and a man who chooses not to spend himself is a man saving up for something. I did not know yet what he was saving for. I only knew, walking back toward the head of the stairs with Hale's words in my ears, that I would rather have a man like that between a crowd and the water than any 10 of my constables, and that the Crown had put him at the one post on the walk where that mattered most, and had done it, as the Crown does so many wise things, entirely by accident. I came back to the head of the stairs, to find that Perrin Vance had discovered a new amusement. There was a vendor working the crowd near the third brazier, an old woman with a tray of sugared nuts and candied peels slung from her neck. The small license trade the household permits along the walk on festival nights, and Vance had planted himself in front of her and was making a game of it, taking a twist of sugared nuts, tasting it, declaring it fit only for pigs, and dropping it on the stones, then reaching for another. For the pigs, he announced to his friend's laughter, letting a second twist fall, and this, and this. My father pays the tithe that lets you stand on this walk at all, old mother, so I'll have the best of your tray or you'll have none of my custom, and none of anyone's, once I've told the household what filth you're selling by the king's own fire. The old woman stood with her tray and her face carefully blank, doing the arithmetic that the poor always do around the powerful, deciding it was cheaper to be robbed than to object, and Vance ground a fallen sweet under his heel and grinned at her flinch. It was a small cruelty, smaller than the wine, and it was worse than the wine, because the wine had been thrown at a man trained and armed and able to bear it, and this was aimed at an old woman who could not. I stepped in and moved him off her and pressed a coin of my own into her tray to make her whole, and she would not meet my eye, and Vance drifted back toward the water laughing, and I understood that the wine on the Guardsman had not been the start of the man's cruelty. It had only been the loudest of it. The man left a wake of small ruined things behind him wherever the crowd was thickest, and he had been leaving it all evening, and the machinery, my machinery, the household's machinery, the whole apparatus of he is not to be handled, had swept along in his wake, tidying it up and pressing coins into trays and calling it peace. That was the moment I stopped waiting for permission. I did not know the night was about to become a matter of life and death. I thought only that I had watched a man abuse an old lamplighter and an old vendor and a young guardsman, and that if I managed one more of his cruelties into quiet, I would not be able to wear the provost's black in front of a mirror. I sent one of my constables to fetch 2 more from the forecourt, quietly, so that when I took Perrin Vance off the walk, there would be enough of us to do it without a struggle that the crush could turn dangerous. I meant to have him gone within a quarter hour. I have wondered ever since what the night would have been if I had been a quarter hour faster, if the bells had rung a little later, if the crowd had surged a little less. But the bells did not ring later, and the crowd did not surge less. And so the wake of small ruined things was about to become something no coin in any tray could make whole. The first thing he did when he tired of being pleasant was to go after a smaller target. That is the way of it with men like him. They test the softest thing near them to see if the world has any teeth at all. A lamplighter had come along the parapet, one of the old crown servants whose task on illumination night is to tend the fire bowls, to trim the wicks of the lesser lamps, and keep the great braziers fed from the coke scuttles chained at the base of each stand. He was a bent, gray man of 60 or more, moving carefully in the crush with his long trimming pole, and Perrin Vance stepped into his path as he passed, and would not let him by. "You," Vance said. "Old man, this fire's low. My father's iron, and you let the fire go low. Feed it. Go on, feed it, that's your work, isn't it? You're not standing here to insult me too." "It's tended, sir," the old man said mildly, trying to step around. "They're all tended. If you'd let me pass, there's others down the walk want." Vance knocked the trimming pole out of his hands. It was not quite a blow at the man, but it was near one, and the long pole clattered down across the parapet and half of it hung out over the black water, while the old lamplighter grabbed for it. The crowd nearest them shifted back the way crowds do, opening a little space around trouble, and in that space Perrin Vance stood tall and pleased with himself, and I began to move again. But before I reached him, something happened that changed the shape of the whole night, and it happened at the head of the water stairs. Guardsman Thorne had turned his head. It was the smallest motion. A man who had stood through spiced wine flung in his face without so much as a blink had, at the sound of an old servant's pole clattering toward the drop, turned his head a precise few degrees and fixed his eyes on Perrin Vance. He did not leave his post. He did not speak. But the stillness had changed its quality. It was no longer the stillness of a man ignoring the world. It was the stillness of a man who has begun, very deliberately, to watch one particular part of it. I have hunted enough men to know the difference between a sentry and a hound, and in that moment Guardsman Thorne stopped being a sentry. Vance felt it. Drunk as he was, he felt the guard's eyes come onto him, and instead of chastening him, it thrilled him because at last, the clockwork had moved. "There," he crowed, wheeling back toward the water stairs, abandoning the old lamplighter entirely. "There, you see, he can move after all. Look at him, look at me. What is it, toy soldier? Don't like me correcting the help? Is the old man a friend of yours?" He came back down the walk toward Thorne's post with his friends trailing, and the crowd, which had begun to thin around him, thickened again, because a scene that has run out of steam and then reignites draws a bigger audience than it ever had, and half the walk now knew that the drunk gentleman and the silent guard were the show worth watching while they waited for the king. I got to the old lamplighter first and put his pole back in his hands and told him quietly to get himself down the walk and out of it, and he went, grateful and frightened. And I turned to find that Perrin Vance had closed the distance to Thorne again, and this time he had brought his hands into it. He shoved the guard, flat-palmed both hands, against the breast of the red tunic, a hard, contemptuous shove of the kind that in any tavern in the realm begins a brawl. Guardsman Thorne rode it. He was a big man and well-planted, and the shove rocked him back perhaps an inch and no more, and he settled again onto his post like a door swinging shut, and his eyes never left Vance's face. That non-reaction, the utter refusal of the guard's body to give the drunk the fight he was trying to buy, drove Perrin Vance past the last of his sense. "Fight me," he said, softer now and worse for being soft. "You clockwork coward. You'll stand there and let me shove you, and you won't lift a hand because they've bred it out of you, haven't they? You're not a man, you're a fixture. My father could have you melted down for scrap and reordered by morning." He shoved again, harder, and again the guard rode it, and a few in the crowd had stopped finding it entertaining now. I heard a man near me say low to his wife, "Where are the provosts then? Why doesn't someone stop him?" And I felt the question land on me like a hand on the back of my neck, because I was the provost, and I was not stopping him, and every soul on that walk could see it. I made my decision then, or I began to. I had had enough of Captain Bell's 3 words. Wine on a uniform I might have managed. Hands on a guardsman before 1,000 witnesses I could not, and I would take the Vance boy off the walk and let Master Vance's iron do what it liked about it in the morning. I started forward with 2 of my constables converging from the far side, and if the night had let me reach him then, this would be a small story, a drunkard removed, a scene closed, a delicate matter mishandled and hushed. But between me and Perrin Vance stood the whole banked weight of the festival crowd, and the crowd had grown, and the crowd was pressed 3 and 4 deep against the low parapet along the canal. And just as I began to shoulder into it, the bells in the palace towers began to ring the hour, and every face on the Queen's walk turned as one toward the eastern balcony, because the ringing meant the king was coming out. You have never heard a sound like 100,000 people going quiet at once and then breathing in. The whole walk surged, not violently, but the way a tide surges, an involuntary lean of the entire crowd toward the balcony, thousands of bodies shifting a half step in the same direction to see. And the direction they leaned was along the canal, and the pressure of all that leaning ran down the promenade like water down a trough, and banked up hardest exactly where the walk narrowed, at the head of the water stairs, at Guardsman Thorne's post, where the low parapet was all that stood between the front rank of the crowd and the 12 steep steps down into the dark. I felt it happen before I understood it. I felt the crowd around me tighten and move, felt myself carried a pace closer to the water whether I willed it or not, and I saw the danger arrive in a single sick instant. The parapet at the head of the stairs was old, its capstone set by masons dead 100 years, and the rope that closed off the stairs was strung on 2 brass stanchions socketed into that same old stone, and now the whole forward weight of a celebrating city was leaning on it, and directly against the stanchions, jammed there by the surge, was a family, a father with a small one on his shoulders and another held tight against his side, a mother with her arm hooked through his. Ordinary festival goers who had wanted only to see the king, and had been carried by the crowd into the worst place on the walk to be. And Perrin Vance, wine-blind and furious, and utterly unaware that the ground had changed beneath everyone, chose that exact moment to make his biggest scene yet. He grabbed the barrel of Guardsman Thorne's rifle. He got both hands on it and hauled, meaning, I think, only to wrench it from the guard's grip, to take the toy soldier's toy, and hold it over his head like a boy who has snatched a stick from a smaller boy, to force at last the reaction the whole night had denied him. He did not understand what a rifle is. He did not understand that the thing he had grabbed at was not an ornament but a weapon, loaded and slung according to the standing orders of the household, and that wrenching it about in a crowd of thousands was not mischief, but the closest thing to murder a drunk man can do without meaning to. Guardsman Thorne did not let go, and he did not let it turn. This is the moment I have gone over more times than any other, because it happened in under 2 seconds and it contained more discipline than most men manage in a lifetime. A frightened man, or an angry one, would have pulled back, and a pull against Vance's drunken weight would have swung the muzzle across the crowd. A weak man would have lost the grip. Thorne did neither. He rolled his whole body into the rifle, driving the barrel down and inward, toward the stone of his own post, toward the one direction on that whole crowded walk where the weapon pointed at nothing but old flagstone, and he pinned it there, muzzle to the ground with the full weight of his shoulder, while Perrin Vance hauled and swore and hung off it like a man trying to pull down a tree. The guard's arms did not shake. His face, turned now fully to the drunk man's, was not the face of a fixture. It was the face of a soldier doing arithmetic at speed, and the sum it was working was not how do I win this, but where does everyone else stand? "Let go, sir," Thorne said. 2 words, the first words I heard him speak all night, and they were not loud. They were pitched under the noise of the crowd, level, almost courteous, the voice of a man who has decided that the last thing this situation needs is a raised voice, and they landed on Perrin Vance like cold water, because the toy had spoken, and the speaking was somehow more terrible than any shout. Vance's face went slack with surprise, and for half a heartbeat his grip loosened, and in that half a heartbeat Guardsman Thorne did not tear the rifle free and step back to safety as any of us would have. He could not, because to step back was to abandon the head of the water stairs, and the head of the water stairs was where the family was, and behind him now the crowd's forward lean had become a slow, grinding press against the old parapet, and the parapet had begun, with a sound like a large door settling, to give. I heard it, Over the whole ocean of the crowd I heard that low grind of stone, and I saw the father with the small one on his shoulders lurch as the capstone under his hip shifted, and I saw his face turn from the balcony, and the king's coming toward the drop at his back with the particular horror of a man who has just felt the ground he trusted move. He could not step back. There was nowhere to step. The crowd was a wall behind him. He could only be pushed forward against a parapet that was failing, or sideways toward the roped-off stairs, whose brass stanchions were even now leaning outward under the strain. And Guardsman Thorne, with a drunk man's hand still on his rifle, made the decision that the whole of his training and the whole of his character had been built to make, and it was not the decision to protect himself. He released the rifle. I want to be plain about what that cost him, because a man who has never worn the uniform will not understand it. A guardsman's weapon is his charge. To let it go, to surrender it in a crowd, is against every standing order he has ever sworn to, a thing he would answer for at a court of inquiry for the rest of his career. Thorne let it go anyway, but he let it go the way a master craftsman sets down a tool, not the way a frightened man drops one. In one motion he twisted the barrel down and out of Vance's hands, so that the momentum of the drunk man's own pull staggered Vance backward and away from the water, and Thorne let the rifle fall to the stone at his post, where it lay muzzle-safe against the wall. And he turned, abandoning post, abandoning weapon, abandoning 19 different orders in a single stride. And he threw himself against the failing parapet at the head of the water stairs and became, with his own body, the thing the old stone could no longer be. He got his back to the drop. He set his boots against the base of the leaning stanchion and braced his shoulders across the gap where the capstone had shifted, and he took the forward weight of the crowd, a family, and behind them a dozen more, and behind them the leaning mass of thousands across the breadth of his own back, and he held it. I saw his face over the father's shoulder, jaw set, the cord standing in his neck, the wine stain still dark on his chest, and I understood at last what I had been watching all night. The stillness was never emptiness. It was this, held in reserve. Every insult he had ridden, every shove he had absorbed, every drop of wine he had let dry on his tunic. He had been keeping something back the whole time, refusing to spend it on a fool, saving it, whether he knew it or not, for the one instant when it would be needed for something that mattered. And now it mattered, and he spent all of it at once. "Back," he said, and now his voice was loud. Now the guard who would not answer a taunt with a whisper filled the whole head of the walk with a single command that cut through the crowd's noise like a blade through rope. "Everyone back from the wall. Back. Now." A crowd will not obey a drunk and it will not obey a scene, but it will, at the last, obey a soldier who has planted himself between it and a drop, and given it an order in a voice that leaves no room for the question. The front ranks heard him, and more than heard him, saw the guard with his back to the black water holding the parapet up with his spine, and the horror of it did what no provost's whistle could have done. It made the crowd want to go backward instead of forward. The pressure eased by a hand's breadth, then a foot. The father got his boots under him and dragged himself and his family sideways off the failing capstone into the space the crowd was opening, the small one still clinging to his neck, unharmed, wide-eyed, too young to know how near the edge of the night had come. And Guardsman Thorne stayed exactly where he was, back to the drop, holding the line he had made of himself, until my constables and I finally broke through the last of the press and got our hands and our shoulders onto the parapet beside him and took the weight off his back. It was over, or I believed for the second time that night that it was over. The king had not yet reached the balcony. The bells were still ringing. Most of the vast crowd along the walk had felt nothing worse than a surge and a squeeze, and knew nothing of how close the head of the stairs had come to disaster. We got the family clear. We got a cordon of constables across the broken parapet. Guardsman Thorne straightened, breathing hard, retrieved his rifle from where it lay against the wall, checked it with the swift, sure hands of a man for whom that check is older than thought, and returned. I swear to you, returned to his post, took up his stand at the head of the water stairs beside the ruin of the parapet, and became a statue again, as though the last 2 minutes had been a thing that happened to some other man. And that, I thought, was the shape of the story. A drunk fool, a disaster narrowly missed, a guardsman who had done something quietly magnificent that the king would never hear of, and the newsman would never print because Master Vance's iron was under every fire on the walk and delicate matters get managed. I even felt, God help me, a kind of relief, the relief of a man who thinks the worst has passed and the hushing can begin. I did not yet understand that Perrin Vance was not finished. I had made the oldest mistake a provost can make. I had turned my attention to the aftermath while the cause of it was still on its feet. Because Perrin Vance, staggered back from the water by the twist of his own failed grab, humiliated now not by silence but by the sight of the whole walk cheering a guardsman and no one at all looking at him, had gotten up from the flagstones where he'd stumbled, and he had found, in the roar and the relief and the ringing of the bells, one last idea. His eyes had gone to the nearest of the great brazier stands, his father's iron, 12 feet of fluted Vance column crowned with a bowl of fire, bolted to the stone at the very lip of the water stairs, and I saw him set both hands against it, and I saw the drunk certainty in his face that this, at last, this would make them look at him, and I started to scream a warning that no one could hear. He meant, I am sure, only to rock it, to seize the great column and shake it so the flames guttered, and the crowd cried out, and every eye came back to Perrin Vance, master of the moment, the man who could make even the fire jump. He did not know, how could a man who has never in his life borne a consequence know, that the brazier stands were bolted for a light seaward wind, and not for a grown man's drunken weight thrown against them, that the clawed iron feet were socketed into stone worn soft by 300 years of river damp, that the fire bowl at the top held a good 1/2 weight of burning coke, and that a stand rocked hard enough at the base will not merely gutter but topple and topple from the lip of the water stairs, directly across the packed heads of the crowd banked below it. He threw his shoulder into the column. The great stand swayed. A gout of sparks lifted from the bowl and rained hissing down toward the parapet, and a woman screamed, and Perrin Vance laughed at the sound of the scream, because a scream was a reaction and reactions were all he had ever wanted, and he drew back to throw himself against it again, harder, and this time the iron would go over. There was no time for me to reach him. There was no time for anyone to reach him. There was time only for the man already standing at the head of the water stairs, 3 paces away, who had spent the whole night learning the exact geometry of that ground. Guardsman Thorne moved. I have watched soldiers fight. I have broken up tavern brawls and stood in the shield line at the harvest riots and seen violence done by men who were very good at it. And I tell you, I had never seen anything like the economy of what Edrick Thorne did in the next 3 seconds. He did not lunge at Perrin Vance. A lunge at the man would have done nothing to the falling iron. He went instead for the stand 3 long strides that carried him past Vance entirely, and he got his shoulder and both hands against the fluted column at the instant Vance's second heave sent it past its balance, and he took the whole toppling weight of it, 1/2 ton of iron and fire, into his own braced body, and he did not try to stop it. That was the genius of it, the thing a panicking man could never have done. He knew he could not stop 1/2 ton once it had begun to fall, so he did not fight the fall, he steered it. He turned the column as it went over, walked it around on its own clawed foot the way a woodsman turns a falling tree by the last hinge of its stump, and he swung the bowl of fire away from the packed parapet and out over the empty roped-off water stairs, out over the black canal, so that, when the great stand at last tore its bolts from the soft stone and it went down into the water and not onto the crowd. The fire bowl struck the canal, and the night filled with a great hiss, and a rolling cloud of steam lit orange from beneath, and the burning coke went into the dark water and died there, harmless, and the iron column crashed down across the old stone stairs with a sound like a bell the size of a house, and a wave of foul, warm canal water sheeted up over the parapet and soaked the front ranks of the crowd, and soaked Guardsman Thorne to the waist, and not one soul was burned. Not one. The sparks that had rained down left small dark stars on 100 cloaks and singed no skin. The half-ton of fire that a drunk man had launched at 1,000 people went into the canal because one guardsman had understood in the half-second he had that he could not stop it and so must aim it. And then, only then, with the iron down and the fire drowned and the crowd reeling back from the steam, Guardsman Thorne turned to Perrin Vance. He did not strike him. I need you to hear that because everyone who tells this story now gets it wrong, and the wrongness of it is an insult to the man. There are 100 versions on the walk now that have the guard break the drunkard's jaw, lay him out on the stones, throw him in the canal after the fire. Thorne did none of it. He crossed the 2 paces to where Perrin Vance stood swaying and gaping at the steam, and he took him by the collar and the arm in a grip that a struggling man could not have broken, a soldier's control hold, firm and exact and entirely without malice, and he turned him, and he walked him 3 steps back from the edge of the water stairs to the safe center of the walk, and he put him down onto his knees on the stone and held him there. That was all. He removed the danger from the edge, and he immobilized the man who was the danger, and he did it with no more violence than a farrier uses to hold a frightened horse. And when it was done, he looked up over the kneeling man's head and found me in the crowd, and he said, in that same level voice, the third and last thing I heard him say that night. "Provost, this man is yours now if you'll have him. If you'll have him." As though he knew, as though he had known all along, better than I had, that the whole question of the night was not whether the drunk would be stopped, but whether I would do my duty when the stopping was done, or whether I would manage it, the way I had managed the wine and the shoving, into nothing. He was handing me not just a prisoner but a choice, and he was handing it to me in front of 1,000 witnesses and the drowned wreck of Master Vance's iron, and he was watching to see which man I would turn out to be. I have not always been proud of the provost I was. I was proud of the one I became in the next moment. "I'll have him," I said, and I took Perrin Vance out of the guardsman's hands and into my own, and I said the words I should have said 3 hours before under the forecourt arch, loud enough for the front ranks to hear and the newsmen among them to write. "Perrin Vance, you are arrested for assault upon a guardsman of the household and for reckless endangerment of the king's subjects, and you will answer for it before the crown." And I clapped the provost's irons on his wrists, and the small cold sound of them closing was, I think, the first consequence Perrin Vance had ever in his life been made to feel. He did not believe it. Even then, even kneeling and ironed and soaked with canal water on the stones of the Queen's Walk, he did not believe it, because the machinery that had stood between him and every edge his whole life had never once failed him, and he could not conceive that it would fail him now. He turned his head and looked up at me with an expression of pure, blank astonishment, the look of a man who has walked into a wall that was never there before. "You can't," he said. "Do you know who my father is? My father's iron is under every fire on this walk. My father's contracts, you can't, my father will have your coat for this. He'll have your coat and this toy soldier's head. Do you understand me? Do you know who my father is?" "I do," I said. "I know exactly who your father is. And I think, sir, before this night is out, so will he." I did not yet know how right I was, or how the very name he was using as a shield was about to become the sword that fell on him, because I did not yet know who had been watching from the eastern balcony, or that the king had reached it a full minute before the brazier fell, or that among the household party gathered there beside his majesty to look down on the illuminated walk had stood the one person in the realm whose judgment Master Halbert Vance could neither buy nor bully, and that she had seen the whole of it, from the wine to the water, with her own eyes. Princess Adela is the king's sister, and she is not a woman given to spectacle. Where the crown ceremonies are concerned, she keeps to the edges of them, watching more than she is watched, and it is a mistake, a mistake many have made and few made twice, to take her quietness for softness. She had come out onto the eastern balcony at the king's side to look down on the illumination, and from that high vantage above the noise, she had seen the small dark drama at the head of the water stairs unfold in miniature beneath her. The wine, the shoving, the rifle wrenched about in the crowd, the parapet giving way, the guardsman becoming a wall with his own back, and then the great column of fire steered out over the water by a man soaked to the waist. She had seen all of it. And where a lesser member of the household might have turned away and let the provost sweep it quietly under, Princess Adela had turned to the officer of the watch beside her and said, in the level way that runs in that family, "Bring the guardsman to me. Bring the man he arrested, and send for whoever the drunkard keeps naming as his father." So it was that within the hour, while the last of the illumination burned itself out along the walk, and the crowd went home carrying the story in 100 different and mostly wrong versions, I found myself in the stone gallery off the forecourt, a long, plain, torchlit hall the household uses for the business it does not do in public, standing between my ironed prisoner and the most dangerous quiet I have ever been in. At the far end, in a plain chair, sat Princess Adela. The king had not come. He had a realm's worth of ambassadors to be seen by on illumination night and could not vanish to deal with one drunkard, but he had sent his sister to sit in his place with his authority behind her, and everyone in that gallery understood that whatever she decided for the crown. Crown Prince Rowan stood at her shoulder, young and grave. And along the wall, brought in as witnesses, stood the people of the night, the old lamplighter twisting his cap in his hands, the father from the water stairs, pale still, the small ones sent home safe with their mother but the memory of the edge plain on his face, 2 of my constables, and at the center of it, out of his tunic now, and wrapped in a dry cloak someone had found him but standing as straight as if he were still on post, Guardsman Edrick Thorne. Perrin Vance had recovered some of his certainty on the walk from the walk. The cold of the irons had frightened him, but frightened men reach for whatever has always saved them, and what had always saved Perrin Vance was his father, and so as we came into the gallery he had begun again, low and urgent, the only song he knew. "You've made a terrible mistake, all of you. My father is Halbert Vance, the crown's own ironmaster. Every gate you walk through tonight my family forged. You cannot, when he hears how I've been handled, ironed like a common thief, manhandled by that soldier, there will be a reckoning, do you hear me? There will be." "There will," said Princess Adela. "Be quiet until it comes." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Perrin Vance shut his mouth and we waited, and presently the great doors of the stone gallery opened and Master Halbert Vance came in. I had never met the elder Vance, only his iron. He was a broad, heavy, deliberate man of 60, with the scarred forearms of someone who had made his fortune with his own hands before he made it with other men's, and he came into that gallery braced for war. Word had reached him, a garbled word, the kind that travels fastest, that his son had been arrested and roughed up by a guardsman at the illumination, and he had come in the certainty that this was a thing to be shouted down and paid off and made to disappear before morning, because that is what every such thing in Perrin's life had been. He took in the gallery with one sweep of a hard eye, the princess, the prince, the witnesses, his iron son, and he went straight to the attack, because attack was how such matters were won. "Your Highness," he bowed to Princess Adela, but it was a bow with a blade in it. "I don't know what my son is accused of, but I know he's the worse for wine, and I know a boy in his cups is no criminal, and I'll not have him ironed like a footpad over some scuffle with a sentry. Whatever's been damaged, I'll pay for it twice over and gladly. You'll find no man in the realm pays his debts quicker than Halbert Vance. Let's have the irons off him and settle this between reasonable people, and I'll thank you to remember that the household and I have done a great deal of business these 20 years and will, I hope, do a great deal more." There it was, laid on the table in the first breath, the money, the contracts, the reminder of who was owed. It was, I have no doubt, the exact speech that had bought his son out of a dozen scrapes before this one. It had never once failed him. Princess Adela let the silence sit a moment after he'd finished. Then she said, "Master Vance, before you spend any more of your credit with the crown, I think you should hear what your son did tonight. Not from the provost, whose word you would dispute. Not from the guardsman, whom you have already decided is a liar. From me. I was on the balcony. I saw all of it. And when I have finished, you may decide for yourself whether this is a matter of a boy and his cups and a scuffle with a sentry, or whether it is something else. Will you hear me? A careful man hears the ground shift under a careful woman's courtesy. Halbert Vance was a hard man and a proud one, but he had not built what he built by being a fool, and something in the princess's evenness reached him where no shout could have. He inclined his head. "I'll hear your highness." So she told him. She told it plainly and in order, without heat, the way you would read a ledger, and a ledger read plainly is a terrible thing when the sums are all on one side. She told him of the wine flung in the guardsman's face, and how the guardsman had not moved. She told him of the old lamplighter shoved from his path, and of the trimming pole knocked toward the water, and here the old man by the wall nodded, twisting his cap, and Halbert Vance's eye went to him and came back harder. She told him of the shoving, and of the rifle of his son's hands on a loaded weapon in a crowd of thousands, and of the guardsman rolling the muzzle down into the stone at the cost of his own standing orders, so that it pointed at no one. She told him of the parapet giving way under the crowd's surge, and of the family carried against the failing wall, and of the guardsman abandoning his post and his weapon both to set his own back against the drop, and hold 1,000 people off a family with his spine. And she told him last of the brazier of his own iron, Master Vance, the great stand you cast and bolted for the crown, thrown down by your son's own shoulder with 1/2 weight of fire in its bowl, and of how it would have fallen across the packed heads of the crowd, across women and children and every soul banked below it, if one guardsman had not understood that he could not stop it, and so had turned it, at the risk of his life, out over the water where it could kill no one. "It went into the canal, Master Vance," she said. "Your fire went into the canal and not into the crowd, and the only reason 100 of my brother's subjects are alive and unburned tonight is that man there." She did not point, she looked, and everyone's eyes followed hers to Edrick Thorne, standing straight in his borrowed cloak, who your son called a toy and a coward and a fixture, and whose head you walked in here just now promising to take. That is what your son did tonight. Now, you have offered to pay for whatever was damaged. Tell me, Master Vance." And here, for the first time, something came into the princess's voice that was not level at all. "What is your price for a child gone over that parapet? Name it. You are a man who settles things with coin. Name me the coin that settles that, and we will have the irons off your son directly." I have said the whole night turned on a single act of restraint, and it did the guardsman's. But there was a second turning in the stone gallery, quieter than the first and, in its way, harder to watch, and it happened in the face of Halbert Vance. I watched the fight go out of him, not the way it goes out of a beaten man all at once collapsing. It went out of him the way iron cools, slowly, from the outside in, the red bluster fading to gray while some deeper thing set hard beneath. He had come in ready to buy and bully and shout, and he had run headlong into a woman who could not be bought and a truth that could not be shouted down. And worst of all, he had been made, this proud, deliberate, self-made man, to stand in a torchlit hall and see his son plainly, perhaps for the first time in his life. He turned his head slowly and looked at Perrin. And Perrin, God help him, misread it entirely and thought his father's silence meant the shield was being raised and said, in a small, triumphant voice, "There. You see, Father's here now. Father will." "Be silent." Halbert Vance did not shout it either. He said it the way you close a furnace door, and then to the princess in a voice gone rough, "There is no coin, your highness. You know there is not, or you would not have asked it. I have spent," he stopped, and I saw the old man's throat work. "I have spent 20 years teaching my son that there is a coin for everything, that whatever he broke I would pay for, That the world was a thing that could be settled with the Vance name and the Vance purse, and that edges were for other men to fall off of. He looked at his son's face, uncomprehending and still half triumphant in its irons, and something in the old man's own face broke and reset. I made him. This, what you have described, this thing that nearly killed a family at the king's own fire, I made it, as surely as I made the iron it was done with. And a man who makes a bad thing does not get to unmake it by paying someone to look away. The gallery was very quiet. Perrin had gone white. So I will not name a coin, Your Highness, Halbert Vance said, because there is not one, and because if I name one now I will only be doing to the crown what I have done to my son these 20 years, and I find, his voice caught again, I find I have done enough of that for one lifetime. I withdraw the offer. I withdraw all of it. Do with him what the law does with any man who would throw fire into a crowd. He is not to be handled, Your Highness. Let him, for once in his life, be handled exactly as any other man would be. He is not to be handled. The same words Captain Bell had used to me under the arch at the 6th bell, the words that had bought Perrin Vance 3 hours of impunity and nearly bought the crowd a catastrophe, turned now completely inside out in his own father's mouth, made to mean their own opposite. I have been a provost 19 years, and I did not know until that moment that a sentence could be an instrument of shame, and then, in the same breath by a different man, an instrument of honor. Halbert Vance had just laid down the one thing he had spent a fortune never to lay down, the shield. He had chosen, in front of the crown, to let his son fall on the edge he had spent his whole life keeping his son away from, because he understood at last that the falling was the only thing that might make a man of what was left. Perrin made a sound then, and it was not the bluster of the walk. It was a young man's voice with all the certainty gone out of it, understanding for the first time that the machinery had stopped, that the ground he had leaned on all his life had simply, quietly been withdrawn. "Father," he said, "Father, you can't. Do you know who my father?" And then he heard himself say it, the old spell, to the very man it named, and it died in his mouth, because for the first time in his life the answer to "Who is your father?" was not a shield but a judgment. Princess Adela let it sit. Then she gave the crown's word, and she gave it the way that family gives such things, quietly, exactly, and without any possibility of appeal. "Perrin Vance," she said, "you will be held at the crown's pleasure and tried before the household court for assault upon a guardsman and for the reckless endangerment of the king's subjects, and your father's name will neither help you nor harm you there, for the court does not know it. You forfeit your place at every crown occasion henceforth. You will not stand upon the Queen's walk again. And when the court has done with you, you will make what amends a man can make, not in your father's coin, but in your own labor and your own years, to the family you nearly widowed and orphaned tonight, and to the household you shamed. That is the crown's judgment. Take him." My constables took him. He went not raging but stunned, a man walking out of the only world he had ever known into a colder and truer one, and his father did not look at him as he passed, and I think that not looking was the heaviest sentence of all. At the door Perrin stopped and looked back, not at the princess, not at his father, but at Guardsman Thorne, the man he had spent the whole night trying to break, and whatever he saw in that still face I cannot tell you, but he flinched from it, and then he was gone, and the stone gallery let out a breath. That would be ending enough, the arrogant humbled, the machinery stopped, the shield laid down by the very hand that had always raised it. But there was one thread left, and it was the one I cared most about, because it was the one the machinery of that night could still have gotten wrong. Guardsman Edrick Thorne had, by the letter of his standing orders, committed a string of offenses grave enough to end any guardsman's career. He had spoken on post. He had left his post. He had surrendered his weapon in a crowd. Every one of those is a matter for a court of inquiry, and I have known good men broken for a single one of them. And I stood in that gallery cold with the fear that the household, having dealt out justice to the drunkard, would now turn and deal out its rigid, rule-bound injustice to the man who had saved everyone, that the same crown that had refused to manage Perrin Vance would, out of pure procedure, court-martial the guardsman for the crime of doing right. Princess Adela turned to him, and I held my breath. "Guardsman," she said, "you left your post." "I did, Your Highness." He did not flinch, and he did not excuse it. The post was the head of the water stairs. "My orders are to hold the ground I stand on and to keep the crown's subjects safe upon it. When the wall failed, the ground I stood on and the subjects upon it were about to go into the canal. I judged that holding the wall was holding the post. If I judged wrong, I will answer for it." "You surrendered your weapon." "I did. A weapon is a thing I carry to protect the crown's subjects." In that half-second it had become the one thing most likely to kill them, in a drunk man's hands in a crowd. I put it where it could kill no one, and I went to where I was needed. If I judged wrong, I will answer for that too. Princess Adela looked at him for a long moment. Crown Prince Rowan, at her shoulder, was watching the guardsman with the open, hungry attention of a young man learning in real time what the thing he had been born to command actually looks like when it is real. And the princess said, "And I have carried these words with me ever since, and repeat them to every green constable I train. The orders you broke tonight, guardsmen, were written by men who were trying imperfectly to make more men like you. When the orders and the reason they were written point in different directions, a lesser man obeys the orders and calls it duty. You obeyed the reason. That is not the failure of your training. It is the whole purpose of it. There will be no inquiry. There will be a commendation, and I will carry the account of tonight to my brother myself, in your words and not the newsmen's, so that the king knows exactly whose spine held his subjects off the water while he was being bowed to on a balcony." Thorne inclined his head. He did not smile. I'm not sure I ever saw the man smile. But something eased in the set of those held shoulders, some weight he had been carrying since the moment he let the rifle fall, and I understood that he had walked into that gallery genuinely prepared to lose his career for what he had done and to consider it a fair price, and that the not losing of it was, to a man like that, almost harder to accept than the losing would have been. The old lamplighter was weeping quietly against the wall. The father from the water stairs crossed the gallery, and I thought he meant to thank the guardsman, but he did something better. He simply put out his hand, tradesman to soldier, man to man, and Edrick Thorne took it, and the two of them stood a moment in a handshake that said everything the whole loud night had been trying and failing to say, and then it was done. The story got out, of course. It always does. But it got out true, for once, because a princess had chosen to carry it in the guardsman's words and not the newsmen's, and because 1,000 people had seen the fire go into the water instead of the crowd. Within a week the whole realm was telling it, and telling it right. The drunk who thought his name was Armor, the guardsman who wore 3 hours of insult like weather and then spent everything he'd held back in the one instant it was needed, the father who laid down his shield. People who had never given a moment's thought to the still red figures on the walk began to look at them differently, to understand that the stillness was not emptiness and never had been, that it was a great deal held very quiet against the hour it would be wanted. That, I think, is the part that shocked everyone most. Not that a drunk was arrested. Drunks are arrested every night. But that the toy soldier the whole crowd had laughed at turned out to be the only wall between them and the water, and had been, silently, the entire time. Perrin Vance was tried before the household court, which did not know his father's name and would not have cared if it had, and he answered for what he did with years of his life and his labor, and by every account I have heard he came out of it, a long time later, a quieter and a truer man than the one who threw wine on a glove. His father made good on his word in the only coin that counted. Halbert Vance rebuilt the failed parapet at the head of the water stairs with his own hands and his own iron, and would take no payment for it, and he set an endowment on the crown's lamplighters, the bent gray men who tend the fires and are shoved from the paths of gentlemen, that keeps them and their families to this day. He never spoke of his son to me. But I saw him once a year on, standing alone at the head of the rebuilt water stairs on an ordinary evening, looking down the 12 steep steps into the dark canal, and I did not disturb him because I knew what he was looking at. He was looking at the edge. He had spent 20 years pretending it wasn't there, and now he made himself stand at the top of it and look, and I think that is as near to penance as a proud man gets. As for Guardsman Edrick Thorne, he took his commendation without a word, and the king, I am told, shook his hand and asked to hear the account from his own mouth. And then, having been thanked by his sovereign for holding 1,000 of the realm's people off the water with his spine, Edrick Thorne went back to work. The very next illumination he was on the walk again, and he had asked for the same post, the head of the water stairs, the place no one wants, because it is the one place where the crowd and the drop meet and a man's stillness actually stands for something. I walked past him that night in my provost's black, and the great Vance braziers burned along the promenade, throwing their second city of fire down onto the black water, and the crowd banked up against the new-built parapet, and Guardsman Thorne stood his post exactly as he had stood it the year before, immaculate, motionless, eyes forward, a great deal held very quiet. I stopped, and I did what I had not done that first night and have never failed to do since. I straightened, and I gave him a provost salute, the salute I had been too busy managing delicate matters to give him when it might have changed the shape of the night, and I held it until he had seen it. He did not turn his head. He did not need to. But the smallest thing happened at the corner of his eye, the ghost of an acknowledgment from a man who would not spend emotion he did not have to, and it was enough. It was more than enough. I have arrested lords and lamplighters, cut-purses and cavalry officers, and I have spent 19 years learning who may be touched and who may not. I know now that I had it backwards the whole time. It is not the powerful who may not be touched. It is the ones who stand at the edges the rest of us pretend aren't there, the ones who hold the line while a city leans on it and never ask to be thanked, and who spend a whole night letting a fool throw everything he has at them, saving it all, holding it in reserve, for the one moment it will be needed to keep a stranger's child from going over into the dark. Those are the ones you do not touch. You stand up straight, and you salute, and you thank whatever you believe in that the wall was a man, and the man was where he was supposed to be.